Corporatocracy, a society or system that is governed or controlled by corporations. Plutocrat, a person whose power derives from their wealth. If these concepts seem familiar to you, it's because they are. We're living at a time where the richest man in the world can contribute hundreds of millions of dollars to help the political candidate of his choosing. Then just a few months later, we could see him in the Oval Office standing next to the person he assisted while arguing in favor of cutting the public services that help so many people, calling the recipients of said services the parasite class. Last time I checked, Elon, his corporations, and his contemporaries are the true welfare queens, raking in billions of dollars in government subsidies. Then when their companies go belly up, or when an oil company pollutes an entire Amazonian village in Ecuador, it's the taxpayer who foots the bill. You tell me who's truly parasitic. The reason I bring this up is not because this is unique or new. It may be a little more out in the open than usual, but the act of ultra-rich, plutocratic forces buying off politicians and governments to serve their interests is a tale as old as time. See, the economic model that we live under does a really great job at facilitating the concentration of capital, meaning those at the top get richer while your wages remain underwhelming, to say the least. When these concentrations of wealth grow bigger and bigger, they eventually begin to wield the power to influence politicians and even entire governments. As we witness the emergence of a full-blown oligarchy in the United States, I thought it would be worthwhile to revisit the time where the CIA and an American fruit company teamed up to overthrow a democratically elected president for bananas. Okay, so this wasn't only over bananas, as we will soon see, but they played a role. Guatemala, prior to the 1950s, was not only a country riddled with poverty, but its social organization resembled that of feudalism predicated on a racial caste system. Guatemala was once home to the ancient Maya peoples who fiercely resisted Spanish colonialism in the 16th century. But once the Spaniards had defeated the Maya and successfully colonized the land, they set up a hierarchical society based on race. White people, who made up the minority and owned most of the land and natural resources, were placed at the top of this social system. Below them were the Ladinos, a class composed primarily of mixed-race people. And at the very bottom of this racial hierarchy was the remaining indigenous population of Guatemala, who made up the vast majority of the country.
Guatemala is the kind of Central American country that used to be called a banana republic before people started talking about wars of national liberation. Most of the citizens of Guatemala are Indians, and most of them live in the shadow of a small, wealthy class which owns most of the arable land.
Guatemalan society was known for its poor social mobility, meaning if you were born poor or if you were part of the bottom tiers of society, it was nearly impossible to rise up the ranks and free yourself from poverty. A big reason for this was due to the white elite ruling class and foreign corporations who owned all of the land and resources, thereby making it next to impossible for landless indigenous folks to use Guatemala's resources and land for themselves. Instead, they had to sell their labor to the landowning class for meager wages. In fact, they were literally forced to do so. In 1931, a dictator by the name of Jorge Ubico took power and passed a law stating that all landless indigenous folks had to work for their local landowners for at least 100 days per year. To add insult to injury, the landowning ruling class colluded amongst each other to keep wages artificially low, further exacerbating the crisis of poverty among the landless people. Ubico was just one of the many Latin American right-wing dictators who did everything he could to side with the powerful and against the less fortunate. Thus, in the eyes of the United States government and American corporations, men like Ubico were useful allies. So useful that if they didn't exist, the US would do all they could to prop up, support, and place them wherever they would serve American business interests. One of the prerequisites for a good fascist dictator was anti-communist paranoia. This was a quality present in nearly all of the tyrants that the Americans propped up, and it wasn't a mere coincidence. In the case of Ubico, his anti-communism was so severe that he forbade the usage of language that he interpreted as communist adjacent. Terms like strike, labor rights, trade union were banned, and even the word workers was replaced by employees. This anti-communist hysteria made Guatemala a hotbed for worker exploitation, and therefore very attractive to American business interests who knew they could get away with exploiting cheap Guatemalan labor. Ubico was a very strong American ally. He loved the Yankees, and the Yankees loved him back. He was such a staunch Americaboo that he actually declared war on both Japan and Germany after the Pearl Harbor attack to show solidarity with the US. which is kind of cute of him. But above all, the reason he was such a precious asset to the Americans is because he allowed US corporations to do pretty much whatever they wanted in his country, largely at the detriment of the Guatemalan population, as we will soon see. And that brings us to the United Fruit Company. Now, the United Fruit Company was already deeply entrenched in Guatemala and its economy prior to Yubico's rule. It was known and largely despised by the locals of many Central American countries for decades prior to Yubico. Funnily enough, it was a different US-backed right-wing tyrant who helped United Fruit secure its presence in the region. Yubico merely kept the tradition going. He remained friendly to foreign investments, protected the United Fruit Company's land, gave them even more land, and whenever those pesky workers would pipe up and ask for humane working conditions, he would brutally suppress them. By that point, the United Fruit Company, along with the rest of the white landowning elite, had amassed and hoarded so much arable land that the broader population had grown overwhelmingly fed up with the oligarchy. To make things worse, the United Fruit Company would buy up land for the purpose of leaving it unused just so no one else could acquire that land and use it to compete with them, all while the indigenous population suffered in poverty and hunger. The need for land reform was dire. In 1944, after mass protests against his tyrannical rule, Yubico finally stepped down and handed power over to his general, Federico Ponce. Ponce was also a tyrannical piece of shit, so I'll spare you the details and skip to the part where he was overthrown in a revolt led by Captain Jacobo Árbenz. Árbenz then went on to help write a new constitution that ended censorship, made racism a crime, banned private monopolies, legalized labor unions, ushered in a whole array of workers' rights, and introduced free and fair elections to the country. This led to the election of Juan José Arévalo, who became Guatemala's first democratically elected leader. Arévalo did a lot of great things. He was progressive and a major improvement to the tyrants he replaced, but he ultimately fell short when it came to adequately challenging the United Fruit Company. By the time the 1951 Guatemalan elections came around, Captain Jacobo Árbenz, the guy who led the revolt against the tyrants and helped write the new democratic constitution, decided to run for president. He was somewhat of a Guatemalan hero at the time, so he won the presidency with a comfortable majority. Árbenz, with his balls of steel, was willing to do the thing Arévalo wasn't. He was willing to go up against the United Fruit Company uncompromisingly. He did this through his aggressive but fair land reform program. To quote author William Blum, who used to work for the US State Department and later went on to critique US foreign policy, the centerpiece of Árbenz's program was land reform. The need for it was clearly expressed in the all-too-familiar underdeveloped country statistics. In a nation overwhelmingly rural, 2.2% of the landowners owned 70% of the arable land. The annual per capita income of agriculture workers was $87. Árbenz's land reform program saw the redistribution of unused land to about 100,000 landless peasants. He also improved the lives of workers by giving unions more rights, and his social reforms did not stop there. All of these progressive achievements earned Árbenz the support of many communists and leftists, which he gladly accepted. Although he didn't have communists in his cabinet, they occupied some important sub-cabinet posts and they were employed in the administration of land reform. Árbenz came from a middle-class family and he wasn't raised with particularly radical beliefs, but his wife, Maria, was much farther to his left. Maria and her friends would often gather at the Árbenz home to engage in political discussions, and this introduced Árbenz to many socialist theories. Although he worked with communists and his wife was seemingly drawn to leftist ideas, he himself was not a communist. His political reforms and ideas have been described as anything ranging from redistributive capitalism to social democracy, or as some historians claim, democratic socialism. But that did not stop the US from painting him as a full-blown Soviet puppet in order to justify what they were about to do to his country. But first, let's get back to the United Fruit Company. Even though they were financially compensated for the land they lost due to Árbenz's reforms, the United Fruit Company was livid. They went on to claim that Árbenz's government did not give them an appropriate sum of money. They wanted more. They wanted $16 million, but Árbenz only offered a little over $500,000. Árbenz and his government had arrived at that figure by looking at the United Fruit Company's own declared valuation for tax purposes. To quote from historian Stefan Schlesinger's Bitter Fruit, in compensation for the seized property, the Árbenz government offered over $600,000 in bonds based on United Fruit's declared tax value of the land. United Fruit, like other large landowners, had historically undervalued its property in official declarations in order to reduce its already insignificant tax liability. But now that the declared value was being used to determine compensation, the company howled in protest. I guess they shouldn't have lied on their tax forms. Árbenz's land reform was not the only thing that pissed off the fruit empire. See, United Fruit handled much more than just fruit in Guatemala. In addition to monopolizing Guatemalan banana exports, they owned telephone and telegraph facilities. A subsidiary of the company owned almost all the railroads in Guatemala, and United Fruit had control over the country's only Atlantic harbor. This made it harder for Guatemala to develop its own industries, and as Schlesinger argues, United Fruit had a stranglehold on Guatemala's foreign trade. William Blum goes a step further and claims the United Fruit Company operated as a state within a state. Árbenz set out to fix that. Under Árbenz, Guatemala constructed an Atlantic port and a highway to compete with United Fruit's holdings, and built a hydroelectric plant to offer cheaper energy than the US-controlled electricity monopoly. Árbenz's strategy was to limit the power of foreign companies through direct competition rather than through nationalization, a policy not feasible, of course, when it came to a fixed quantity, like land. Árbenz's reforms were very popular with the Guatemalan population. I mean, a whole bunch of landless peasants were given land for the first time, and with that land came the ability for them to produce and sustain themselves. However, his reforms were not received so positively by the United States, who already began plotting to overthrow Árbenz. It's important to highlight that the United Fruit Company had significant influence over Washington. It held close personal relationships with the Dulles brothers, John and Alan, who served as the Secretary of State and Director of the CIA respectively, as well as many other congressmen and State Department officials. Ann Whitman, the wife of the company's public relations director, was President Eisenhower's personal secretary. Undersecretary of State and formerly director of the CIA, Walter Bedell Smith, was seeking an executive position with United Fruit at the same time he was helping to plan the coup. He was later named to the company's board of directors. According to Schlesinger, the United Fruit Company was working hard to convince the US government that Árbenz was a threat to freedom and must be deposed. He goes on to say that the company hired influential lobbyists and talented publicists to create a public and private climate in the United States favorable to Árbenz's overthrow. And it worked. The US government began a massive propaganda campaign accusing Árbenz and his government of being Soviet puppets. Remember how I mentioned that he worked closely with some communists, he refused to denounce them, and his wife held radical beliefs? Well, all of that, in addition to his land expropriations, was swiftly used against him in typical Red Scare fashion. Árbenz firmly believed in democracy, and that included having communists in his government who contributed to debates and the sharing of ideas. The Americans, who love to overthrow democracies in the name of democracy, would never allow for such free and open debate with communists. In 1953, the CIA started reaching out to right-wing officers in the Guatemalan military and began supplying them with funds and weapons. United Fruit contributed to this process by providing $64,000 in cash up front. The Americans also began to rally support from other Central American dictators like Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, who allowed for the Americans to use his country as an airstrip and a base where they could train hundreds of men in preparation for the overthrow of Árbenz. The US decided on a man named Carlos Castillo Armas to lead the coup against Árbenz and succeed him as the leader of Guatemala. Castillo Armas was a right-wing psychopath who once served in the Guatemalan military and had been living in exile in Honduras. But since he was willing to be a good fascist and protect American business and influence in Guatemala, he was the CIA's guy. As rebel forces were preparing themselves in Nicaragua, Castillo Armas was forming a rebel army of his own in Honduras with the support and backing of the US. In addition to the use of military force, the US partook in a massive propaganda campaign against Árbenz. They flooded Latin American media with over 200 slanderous articles, tens of thousands of anti-Árbenz pamphlets, and even films painting him as a communist tyrant. United Fruit also joined in, spreading gruesome photos of unidentified bodies, which they falsely claimed were the fault of Árbenz. As the US-backed rebels led by Castillo Armas crossed into Guatemala from the surrounding Central American countries, American planes dropped bombs on Guatemala and machine-gunned infrastructure in the attempt to force Árbenz's abdication. And it worked. Jacobo Árbenz stepped down and lived the rest of his life in exile. With Árbenz now gone and Carlos Castillo Armas as the new dictator of Guatemala, bloodshed, and mass suffering returned to the country. Castillo Árbenz started arresting thousands of innocent people for nothing more than being suspected of being communists, and he tortured and murdered a good many of them. Árbenz's land reform program was reversed, and United Fruit benefited greatly from this. In addition to getting all their land back, Castillo Árbenz made it so that banana workers couldn't unionize. This was a fairly common trait in US-backed dictators in the developing world. They would often allow for big American companies to do their business in their country, and if the labor force, which was severely underpaid and exploited, acted up, the dictator or the junta would come in and beat, torture, or kill them. Castillo Árbenz went on to outlaw political parties, labor confederations, and of course, books. The books of Miguel Asturias were quick to be banned, probably because he had been an open critic of United Fruit. The overthrow of Árbenz helped lead Guatemala into a bloody and brutal civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. In a confidential correspondence between Stefan Schlesinger and an experienced American journalist, Schlesinger was told, if the United Fruit Company had not existed, there would have been no US pressure or intervention. The US wouldn't have cared. With no threats to US property, there would have been no problems. If you take anything away from this video, just be wary and skeptical when you see ultra-rich businessmen like Musk or Gates or Zuckerberg or whoever the robber barons of today are, and understand that they are not here to help you. They don't give a fuck about you. When you see someone like Musk, who practically purchased his way into a position where he can now regulate the agencies that regulate his companies, regardless of your political leanings, that should raise some red flags.